Oh! 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 Hey! No! Now you've had your turn. You've just taken 2 volleys and we haven't even had one!
There's an idea that warfare used to be polite. A gentlemanly affair wherein 2 armies would delicately line themselves up at a predetermined place upon a pre-appointed time and take turns shooting at each other. Now, the explanations for this idea can range in complexity and in seriousness, from the simplistic, oh, they were all just arrogant and they didn't care sorts of arguments, all the way to very common myths about how a lack of training and adaptability and inefficient technology all led to warfare being fought that way kind of, sort of by necessity, but also an arrogance, again, like the refusal to adapt and things like that, right? But these ideas are then given much further fuel, of course, by narratives of those armies which would supposedly buck the trend in some way by fighting in more intelligent, practical, and impolite ways. The most notorious example, of course, being the American rebels during their War of Independence. But the reality of early modern warfare was much more complex than that, and the idea of polite warfare is flawed at the best, and it's outright ridiculous at the worst. Simply put, armies didn't fight that way. Throughout all of military history, battles at every scale were met in whatever context was either forced by one side onto the other, or was found to be advantageous by both sides independently, and was thus mutually agreed upon in a sense, but which certainly wasn't a carefully coordinated matter in terms of politeness or anything like that. Rather, the interests of the 2 sides just coincidentally met in a similar way, in a similar time, in a similar place. Any pretense of honor and dignity and whatnot that was added on top of that was more of a nicety than it was a driving force of warfare's material reality. Now, of course, history is a long time, and there are exceptions to every rule, so there probably are a few examples of 2 sides doing exactly what I decry here as a myth, and it was probably some ancient East Asia battle because things get really wonky over there. But my point is that those sorts of things are the rare exceptions, not the rule of the age, and especially not during the European early modern era. It isn't like Napoleon and Wellington were just sitting around eating grapes together on lawn chairs, watching all the poor people slaughter one another. For starters, they would be sitting in much nicer chairs than that. For example, the sort that might be provided by this video's sponsor, Flexispot. If you're like me, you spend a lot of time at your desk, like far too much time. I work at my desk, I chat with friends at my desk. It's a lot of hours, and I've been living for the past year or so in what I like to call high-class homelessness. I think the nomenclature these days is being a digital nomad, and while it's great to travel, it has also landed me in some rather uncomfortable chairs. I'm not kidding. For a good couple of months, I was sitting in this thing. The back support was abysmal. There were no armrests, and I could feel every spring. You can see it here in the background of a live stream that I did a while back. Yeah, it wasn't a fun situation, but then enter Flexispot to save the day. They sent me their C7Max chair, and it is fantastic. It is flexible and durable, it gives amazing back support, and it's infinitely adjustable in ways I could never before have dreamed. The headrest can be tilted to whatever height, angle, and depth you like. The armrest can match whatever position I want to sit in, and it even has an amazing retractable footrest for if I want to stretch out or sit cross-legged or without a footrest at all. Even the seat cushion itself can be adjusted, brought forward or back. And its memory foam is both very comfortable and still supportive for those really long days. And perhaps most important of all is the chair's lumbar support, which is differently designed from most chairs of this type. As you can see, it also is fully adjustable for however you happen to be sitting at the time automatically, and it supports not only the lumbar, but the sacrum as well. It's a very ergonomic and very comfortable design. It's been perfect for both work and play, and has made my life far more comfortable and more pleasant as a result. So if you'd like to check out the C7Max chair for yourself, or their more budget-friendly C5 chair, they both offer an amazing 10-year warranty, and if you don't like them as much as I have, they also offer a full 30-day risk-free trial. You'll find a link for them in the description down below, and make sure to use the code provided there to get the absolute best price. Thank you to Flexispot for sponsoring this video. So where do we get this myth of polite warfare from? Well, firstly, there are a wide range of technical myths regarding the nature of 18th century warfare specifically that really pollute the waters of not just its own discourse, but also that of the whole early modern era. For example, why did soldiers fight in these long lines and shoot at each other while standing up without any cover? Well, a far cry from having anything to do with politeness or even with honor. It was actually by far the most effective means that those soldiers, those armies could fight each other. And I have an entire playlist of videos detailing the many reasons, technological, cultural, and many others, why that was, ranging from the presence of heavy cavalry to the organization of military units during that time period, how they communicated, of course, the need to maximize one's force projection at any given point, but I'm not going to ramble about all of that because, again, I have all those videos where I go into it in detail there, and it would make this video just ridiculously too long. So when we're done here, you can go and check out those individual topics if they are of interest to you. But another example is that we have this idea that firearms during this time period were just so insanely unpredictable and inaccurate that the soldiers were barely even trained in how to use the things, and there was really no chance at all then to hit anything but to line up at super close range and just take turns blasting each other away. The men in this case being nothing more than cannon fodder, their equipment being worth far more than they themselves. But again, these are all myths. Muskets could actually be accurate out to hundreds of yards, with skirmishing typically opening the board at around 300 yards or so. And at least in the case for the British infantry, they could be trained not only in loading and firing quickly, but also in accuracy, with marksmanship drills, men training to take aim at specific targets before pulling the trigger, that sort of thing. Again, I already have videos on all of these topics, so if you're interested in my evidence for any one of these points, you'll find those linked down below for the full discussions. But for this video, I wanted to focus on this very specific myth of armies taking turns shooting at one another. Where does that element of these overall misunderstandings come from? And does it have any grounding in history? Well, actually, it kind of does, but also not really. To explain what I mean, we'll look at the most notorious example where it appears that exactly this thing happened. The Battle of Fontenoy, fought on 11 May 1745 as part of the War of Austrian Succession, which saw a French victory against the forces of Britain, Hanover, the Dutch, and the Holy Roman Empire. Long story short, very long story short, in this battle there was an instance where a British line came up against the French, wherein an officer of the former supposedly called out, "Gentlemen of the French Guards, fire!" To which the French in turn shouted back, "Gentlemen, we never fire first, fire yourselves!" Only for the British to once again insist that the French be the first to "Give fire, gentlemen! Fire, gentlemen!" Of course, such a scenario reads very comedically, almost as if it came from a satirist. Well, where does the story come from? It was a guy named Voltaire. You may have heard of him. He was, among many other things, for a time the official historiographer of France, and in that capacity wrote at length about this battle. And in her article, The Battle of Fontenoy, A Literary Afterlife, Josie Deister with the Voltaire Foundation describes his work as being detailed and well-researched, but also, as one may expect, not without dramatic embroidery and flourish. The article describes how Voltaire would frequently recount very specific speeches and conversations, and even battle cries, as a means of creating an engaging and pointed narrative, sometimes even at the cost of the impression of total historical faithfulness. And it was within that context, rather than from any direct accounts of the battle by those who were there, that we have our main, and to my knowledge only, reference to this event. So maybe Voltaire got it by word of mouth from one of the soldiers who was actually there, or maybe he just made it up because it sounded good. Maybe yet it was something that is grounded in reality, but somewhat exaggerated based on the culture of the times and contemporary tropes of warfare. In any case, at least, we can't take this quote as an historical absolute. But still, what if we gave it the benefit of the doubt? What if we said that it was basically true, that these two lines really did come across each other, and within shouting distance, their two commanders basically had a Canadian standoff? Would that then mean that they were taking turns shooting, that they really were being polite and gentlemanly and whatnot? Well, not quite. If anything, it was actually the exact opposite. Think about it this way. Muskets may be more accurate than people typically give them credit for, but in the chaos of a smoky battlefield, that accuracy relies more on the ability and endurance of the individual soldiers than the actual firearms that they are using. I mean, modern-day firefights tend to be at a similar range as 18th century firefights for that reason. It has more to do with the individual soldier's ability to use the fire. You know, you could have a gun that's accurate out to a kilometer, but if you're using iron sights, the same that they would have been basically using in the 18th century, just a little, sight, single lug of metal at the end of the barrel, well, there's only so much you can utilize that accuracy, let alone if the field is completely covered in smoke and whatnot. But in general, right, the point is that the closer you are to your target, the better your volley is going to be. Muskets are also very slow to reload. You're going to need at least 15 seconds, usually something closer to 30 seconds, to prepare a shot after you fire. And an opposing body of troops can advance a great distance in that half a minute. So let's imagine. There are two groups come across each other. They're both loaded and within effective range. Side A opens fire. They deliver a decently effective volley, and they immediately start to reload, then allowing side B not to return the fire, but instead to advance. They march up as quickly and as closely as they can before halting, and their volley in return then, right before side A is ready to open fire again, is exponentially more effective, crashing into side A and destroying their cohesion, wrecking their morale before they can in turn fire their second volley. Then, through the smoke and the chaos and the hell of war, before side A can regain themselves, side B can either reload that much more quickly because they're in better order and then they could fire again, or even better, they could follow it up with a bayonet charge. Whoever gives fire first, then, unless they can really make their shots count, can potentially be putting themselves in a very dangerous position. If indeed one side at Fontenoy was insisting that the other side fire first, it wasn't an episode of polite turn-taking, it was goading, it was mockery, and a distinctly 18th century form of bravado. in service not merely to the ego, but a very practical military concern. The same way that a boxer might try to bait an opponent into taking the first wide swing before, ducking out of the way and opening up to a counter blow. What? You French think you're so tough? Come on, take your shot, do your best. Then let us close into the more effective range and we're really gonna blow you away. Muskets can be quite accurate weapons, and pot shots between skirmishers and light infantry could well begin out to 300 yards plus for that reason. But the main forces, if they were disciplined enough to maneuver under that kind of peppering fire, they would often seek to hold their fire as long as they could, until they got so close to the enemy as to deliver a single knockout blow, not to soften the enemy up, but to thoroughly devastate them. That is the primary role of close order line infantry. This is also, incidentally, why alternative means of fire than just plain old volley firing is so important, as methods like firing by files or by platoons and the like helped to ensure that at any given time, at least one portion of the line is going to be capable of returning fire should the need arise. It's not just about firing as quickly as you can, but coordinating that fire across the line and employing it in the most effective way. This is exactly what so much of 18th century military doctrine and military training was all about. The marching, the maneuvering, and as they called it, the firings, how they're being carried out and when, to ensure that the enemy cannot maneuver freely. Because if you have everyone fire at once and then you all have to reload, the enemy can just move around, do whatever they want in that time. That's a no-go. 18th century warfare is all about area denial. Make sure you're keeping up a continual fire on the enemy so that they can't just decide to march on up nice and close in the time that you're reloading. Theoretically, at least. Of course, in the actual situation on the ground, it gets really messy. This is something that we see quite commonly in the sources, not just accounts of battles themselves, but again in the treatises and manuals that these officers and military theorists were publishing all throughout the early modern era, as warfare was being treated more and more like a scientific field of study rather than just a martial art, wherein it was the side with the better coordination, the better logistics, training, and doctrine that would win wars, rather than the side that had the bravest warriors. For example, in Lieutenant General Humphrey Bland's Treatise on Military Discipline, the 1743 version in this case, he describes exactly how this principle of withholding one's fire could potentially prove extraordinarily effective. He wrote, "In marching up to attack the enemy, the line should move very slow, that the battalions may be in order, and the men not out of breath when they come to engage. The commanding officer of every battalion should march up close to the enemy before he suffers his men to give their fire. And if the enemy have not given theirs, he should prevent their doing it by falling upon them with the bayonets on the muzzles the instant they have fired, which may be done under the cover of the smoke before they can perceive it, so that by the shock they will receive from your fire, by being close and attacking them immediately with your bayonets, they may, in all probability, be beat with a very inconsiderable loss. But if you don't follow your fire that moment, but give them time to recover from the disorders yours may have put them into, the scene may change to your disadvantage." In fact, he goes on to explain that while this can be a highly effective maneuver to pull off, because of how much risk is involved with it and how it could potentially leave your men right up against the opponent's muzzles whilst being unloaded themselves, it's better to not even try it except in highly specific circumstances. After all, we all know what happens if the enemy can deliver a volley right before your troops, charging in with bayonets, are able to hit them. It is a very high-risk, high-reward movement for the right men to employ in just the right way, depending on a wide variety of factors. For example, the state of the field that's between the opposing lines and how quickly it might be passed. Of course, there were also countless variations on this same theme. For example, the 1757 English translation of the New Regulations for the Prussian Infantry, which describes a method of forcing an enemy from their ground that's basically faking the bland approach. It prescribes that the commanding officer gives the word, "Charge your bayonets," and after the battalion has advanced a little with arms in that position, shoulder. The intent of this is only to discountenance the enemy, for the commanding officer is immediately after to give the word, "Battalion, make ready, present, fire." The battalion having fired is to load again, briskly, and being shouldered is to step off again of its own accord, taking care to march without crowding and in a straight line. Then, once all of that is done, the formation could move to the march, basically the double quick, to either fire again even more closely or to push with bayonets, then finally doing more or less what Bland describes. Although what's interesting here, I think, is that the Prussian drill describes slowing down the advance by having the men reload after their volley, as opposed to Bland, who stressed the need to close in as quickly as possible without any delay, even for reloading. It's a good example, even if a small one, of just how variable infantry doctrine was throughout the 18th century, and just how much theory was floating around about it all, some of which was wiser and more practical than others. Like I said, the early modern era was really the birth of our modern-day scientific approach to military thought. But that's a topic for another day. And remember, of course, that if you'd like to read any of these primary sources for yourself, alongside a whole slew of others, you'll find them all at nativeoak.org's free digital library, alongside information about my other work, including how I donate 10% of all this channel's profits to charity, and our recently published anthology book about trauma, privation, and horror throughout military history called Something Like Philosophy. The effect of all this, then, is that while you could begin to fire at a much further range, units would often find it wise to save their fire, to withhold it until the most effective, critical moment when they might enter the fray on the best possible terms for themselves. So at times, that might even lead to a situation where you have numerous battalions all moving around the field, maneuvering and counter-maneuvering, jostling for that perfect position, while nobody is actually shooting at each other except for maybe the skirmishers. And from the outside, to the untrained eye, that kind of thing might look like polite warfare, where people are just slowly approaching one another and taking turns shooting, even offering, i.e. goading each other's to take the first shot. But in reality, it's anything but polite. It's actually just trying to kill the other guy while limiting the amount of risk that you yourself are facing. You know that if they shoot from all the way over there, they're less likely to hit you than if you can, I don't know, advance 30, 40, 50 yards and then take your own shot. And if that goading ever feels polite, it's more owing to the culture of the times than anything on the ground. You know, it reminds me a little bit of the whole "we can't accept your surrender" bit from A Bridge Too Far. It isn't an earnest statement, it's sarcasm, it's banter, and if anything, it's insulting the abilities of your opponent. And again, all of that is if the quote is even true to start with, which is in itself quite questionable. So that is where this whole idea of taking turns in polite gentleman's warfare comes from. It is a myth, and indeed, it is very silly. Now, if you'd like to learn more about 18th century warfare, well, I have all kinds of videos about it covering an incredibly wide range of topics, which you'll find all linked in a convenient playlist down below. And like I said, if you'd like to do any primary source reading for yourself, or to find any of my recommended reading for secondary scholarship, well, you'll find all of that in the digital library section at nativeoak.org. Now, thank you all for watching, and a most special thanks to my supporters on Patreon, whose steadfast support allows me to make these videos to start with. If you'd like to get them usually a few days early and totally ad-free, then you can check out the Patreon below as well. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.